Hello, I'm Juliette Foster, and welcome to the European Magazine webcast. Now, extreme weather events such as heat waves and flash floods are inflicting a high cost on humanity, the environment, and financial structures. As the authorities in the United States battle to control wildfires in California, among the worst in the state's history, the spotlight has again been thrown on climate change and ways of combating it, all of which begs the question of whether a radical change of thinking is now required. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Gary Yohe, who's the Huffington Foundation Professor of Economic and Environmental Studies, Emeritus. Gary, it's very good to see you. I want to kick this off by personalizing things, looking at your own journey as a scientist. So, when did you start working on climate change and the way that we should be responding to it? Are we talking about something that has been pretty recent or it's very long standing?
It's very long standing. I started in the very early 1980s. Um, I had done my graduate work at Yale and dissertation advisor a couple of years after I left New Haven, phoned me up, his fellow named William Nordhaus, ultimately a Nobel laureate for work in climate. But he asked if I wanted to be involved in a National Academy of Sciences report on changing climate. They had put together a panel to write about it, and he wanted to know if I wanted to play in that game. And it seemed like a really good idea at the time, so I said yes and became involved in that. And it was just a fascinating time. I became one of five economists probably in the world that knew anything about global warming at the time. Um, but the panel would ultimately um, have six Nobel laureates in it out of nine people. And they were thinking about this for the first time. So it was really um, at the very beginning. And that was so fascinating. Uh,
Mm.
that I just picked it up as something that I wanted to do. I had been a theoretical economist worrying about decision making under uncertainty. That's what I was hired to do at Wesleyan, and I was hired to teach that sort of thing. Wesleyan turned out to be a perfect place because they found out that I was interested in climate, and instead of wanting to publish in big deal economics journals, I wanted to publish in Nature and Science. And they said, that's fine. You can do that. You can do whatever research that you want. And as long as you engage your students, bring it back to the classroom, um, teach what we want you to teach, but you don't have to research what we thought we were buying when we hired you. And that's always been the case. If I'd been
Mm.
someplace else, hired as a theoretical economist, they wouldn't have let me do that.
But it was very fortuitous as well, and of course timing is everything because as you've rightly said, back in the 1980s, not many people were talking about climate change and looking at the bigger picture about how it could actually affect societies and how it could affect economies. It all seemed a little bit too abstract, and perhaps from the point of view of some individuals, an inconvenient truth, something
Yeah.
that could be cheerfully disregarded, not looked at.
Um, that's right. It wasn't too long after the Nuremberg report was published by the Academy that American Petroleum Institute and the Cato Foundation and James Buchanan at George Mason um, started to put together an opposition. Um, they thought this was a threat to personal rights and dangerous. And so they began in the late 1980s what became a massive disinformation campaign um, to undermine the credibility of climate science. It was pretty easy back then. There was a lot of uncertainty. Um, they ironically managed to do something that I think was unintended. In the early 1990s, the discernible influence of human activity conclusion appeared in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it was they, the skeptics, who said, okay, that's fine. we don't believe it, but that's just global mean temperature. What does that matter? There, you have to talk about other impacts and things like that. And they were right. We didn't know much more than, well, temperatures are going up, so what? So they generated an enormous research effort among scientists around the world to look for attribution of things that were being observed or predicted by their models, um, and would be fingerprints of climate change. I, with a woman named Camille Parmesan, did a paper in Nature that approached the following problem. We have a lot of natural events occurring, and it looks like they can be attributed to climate change, but they're all disparate. They're all over the place. They're not a global fingerprint. They're just little snapshots around. And we spent 2 or 3 years writing a paper trying to figure out how to take all of that information and statistically turn it into a global fingerprint that
Mm.
climate is changing and it's affecting nature.
But, but,
Uh,
but, 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 but were you surprised at the degree of hostility? Because this was hostility coming from the corporate sector. And of course, it would have distilled to embrace other areas, perhaps the media, before eventually sweeping in the public.
I really was. I was very naive. I was a young scholar. I, Working within a community where productive work and clever ideas and contributing to the knowledge base was rewarded and examined and questioned, and that was honestly done. And I thought that that meant that if we delivered important information to decision makers and ordinary citizens, it was up to us to try to express it in ways that made some sense and would answer their quite relevant so what questions. Um, but I was very surprised that there would be a growing effort to diminish the validity of the science, to diminish the validity and integrity of the scientists, and deliberately get in the way, impede by any means available, including misinformation and disinformation, um, any discussions of doing something about what was going to emerge as clearly a probabilistically valued existential threat to humanity.
And for the sake of context as well, this opposition preceded the rise of social media. So it was organized in an entirely different way that didn't rely on platforms, it didn't rely on emails or anything like that. So that's perhaps what makes it even more astonishing, the degree of success that it had without the influence of digital technology.
That's right. It was a group of people though that did have experience and success doing this sort of thing. So it was the same people that tried to convince the world that smoking wasn't dangerous, and spent years debunking any science that suggested that it was dangerous and caused damage to human health and things like that. They honed their skills very well, and it didn't take them very long to pick up those tools and apply them to climate change because they saw a similar risk to their personal freedoms and the sources of wealth.
When you look at your career and what you've achieved, it has been an incredible learning curve too.
Mm-hmm.
And my point to you is that part of that learning is knowing how to approach decision making when it comes to climate change. What is the approach that you have learned that is the most effective in this area?
Uh, the approach is one that recognizes risk, the concept of risk, as the likelihood of an event happening and the consequences of that event. And instead of trying to think about all of the possibilities and frame them in a cost benefit analysis that um, is suspect at its beginning because of all of the uncertainties that people have to cope with. Um, Instead, recognize the uncertainties and recognize that people face uncertainties all of the time. They buy insurance. They try to live near a place with a fire hydrant. They obey speed laws sometimes when they're driving. and a variety of things like that. So insurance and coping with it, coping with risk, is not unfamiliar to the ordinary person. This is just a much more complicated problem. Um, and so not only did we come up with the idea that this was a risk management problem, it should be approached like that, we also came up with the, I think, significant understanding that it had to be an iterative risk management problem that included things like costs and benefits and attitudes towards risk and sustainability and equity and all those sorts of things. Um, Up until then, people were writing papers that said, here's an emissions trajectory that could be affected by a policy for through the year 2100. Okay, well, the one thing I know about that is the chance of that being the scenario of the future is zero. So, uh, what do you do with replace of that? You look at the risks and you recognize that you're going to have to make mid-course corrections in whatever you're doing. So build that into the system and take away the criticism that uh, oh, this is 15 years since you said this was a really bad thing, and now it's not quite so bad. You lied before. Why should we believe you now? Well, it didn't lie before. That's what it said before. But and we made a policy decision, but we told you we were going to revisit it and make adjustments. And it's not that they were lying before; it's that we're learning. We did some things and we're learning. The other thing we can do is anticipate and try to make the best decisions we can on the basis of the information we have. But again, iterate, recognize immediately from the very beginning that you have to take into account those potential changes, even as you take into account what you're doing in day one.
When you're looking at climate change, the science surrounding it, and the decision making, the new type of decision making to combat it, can there ever be such a thing as tolerable risk? What is tolerable risk?
Um, there is such a thing as tolerable risk, and it's fluid. And complicated, but it is, in its simplest form, society's acceptance of a certain likelihood that XYZ bad thing will happen. And it's a recognition that you can't guarantee 100% that nothing will happen. So building codes do not guarantee that a building won't fall down. But they make it very unlikely that a building will fall down, even in the face of a hurricane. But we can't afford it, probably can't design it so that under all possible circumstances, known and unknown, it won't suffer catastrophic damage. Um, and so we have to recognize that. So are there examples? Well, building codes are examples. Speed limits are examples. We tolerate a certain number of people dying from speeding, because we want to be able to drive 55, 60, 65 miles an hour. We could put speed limits at 25 miles an hour, take longer to get places, but fewer people would die. There's a tolerable level of that risk. I was surprised when I was thinking about tolerable risk that in the United States, 25,000 people a year die of ordinary flu, for which there is in the early fall vaccines to protect yourself from. You could envision far more aggressive policies that would reduce that number. Um, but society has decided that 25,000 people, most of whom I don't know, um, is okay. It's something that we can live with, and it's more prevalent in some states than others. That's society's making a decision about what's a tolerable level of risk. Um, Insurance companies look for tolerable levels of risk, recognizing that um, claims will be made, but they will spread the risk of those claims across the population, and that's the efficiency that comes from insurance. It's not that you eliminate the consequences, it is instead that you spread the consequences across
Mm.
the population. In circumstances where consequences are death or really bad disease, um, for the individual, it's existential, but for society, it's what they've become comfortable with.
Just listening to you, what you appear to be saying is that the approach to climate change, it almost has to embrace the thinking of an insurance executive or insurance industry in terms of actually weighing up the risk, looking at how you can respond, but accepting that within your response, you are not going to eliminate the possibility that something will happen. What you have to do is to try to reduce the risk. So if that's the way of thinking, how do you apply that to sea level rise, SLR, and in particular, when you're looking at areas like San Francisco, where there is that pull, if you like, between acting too much or doing too much or too little, or acting too late or perhaps too early?
Right. No, that's a really good question, and the framing of it is really important. One really creative way of looking at all climate policy is investment in some degree of insurance. Insurance is designed to reduce risk. Risk is likelihood times consequence. Um, Mitigation is an investment in trying to reduce the likelihood of bad things happening, and adaptation is an investment trying to reduce the consequences. Um, but it is an insurance policy because it doesn't affect reality, and in fact, there's a residual out there, and that's why you buy insurance, and the insurance company covers it to the extent possible. In the San Francisco case, it's really fascinating. It has that there's a planning group within the city government that started to worry about risks of the San Francisco harbor to sea level rise. And they read the climate policy suggestions from a variety of other places. They read the IPCC assessments of likelihood and consequence. They did their own studies of consequence. And then they wanted to think about it in the context of the enormous uncertainties that is around a long-term investment project like protecting against sea level rise. You're talking about decades. You might be able to make some changes along the way, but the major decisions have timeframes of decades, and you're really looking to what's it going to look like in 2085 or 2100 when you try to frame the overall question. And so they engaged the Army Corps of Engineers and told them that they wanted the Army Corps to give them alternative protection scenarios, investments that they could make for different levels of sea level rise. And that in particular, they wanted to span the possibilities and the not implausibilities. So a low scenario that sort of continued the trends that had been observed, a scenario that was about twice as fast, get to about 2 feet by 2100. It was on the high end of what the IPCC was reporting for ordinary sea level rise. And then they took a notice of the IPCC's quick dismissal, but still reporting of a very high sea level rise scenario, 6 feet by 2100, that was driven by the melting of the West Arctic ice sheet and potentially the collapse of it. So what happened very, very quickly. So the Army Corps went away, and the planners had divided the coastline into different regions. And so they made the recommendations across a variety of adaptations that went everywhere from building a little bit of protection to retreat from the sea to taking away buildings that were in jeopardy or changing development patterns. And a variety of things like that. And that the Army Corps now analyzed those for the different regions. And for some of the regions, it made sense. It never made sense to use the low sea level rise scenario. That caused too much risk that you wouldn't do enough quick enough. But the middle one was perfectly fine under the assumption that they've said they needed to build in that there would be a mid-course correction in 20 years. So around 2050 or 2045, they would go back and redo the analysis with the new information that would be available then. So that was sort of conservative. It said, yeah, that 6 foot scenario is out there, but for these places, the extra damage wouldn't be all that severe early on. So planning for 20 or 25 years for the medium scenarios is the most efficient choice.
Mm.
But for the Embarcadero, it was not true. The Embarcadero analysis said you have to bite the bullet and assume for your planning purposes for that region the 6 foot scenario and make the investments as if you knew the 6 foot scenario was going to happen. And San Francisco is accepting that, and that is a playoff given the iteration, given the mid-course corrections in 2045, 2050, that it's worth it to do a little bit too much early so that you don't have to make an enormous adjustment in 2045 or 2050 to catch up, because that would be very expensive.
Right,
Um,
but that's interesting how it's applied to San Francisco. Can you see that as perhaps setting a template for elsewhere, not just in the United States, but also other developing economies, because there is a sense of urgency
mhm.
surrounding this.
No, I absolutely do, and to be honest, so do they. It was like the New York panel on climate change under Bloomberg. We knew we were doing some innovative stuff, but we knew it wasn't just for New York, and San Francisco knows that too. And it is a way to frame a really complicated problem into terms that people can understand, and dates that, while the consequences that will be manifest in those states are unknown, the policy decision is known, and so you can make plans accordingly. It also leads to the secondary discussion of, okay, we're gonna change directions maybe in 25 years. What new information do we need? What should we be monitoring? What should we keep track of? Um, is it just local sea level rise, or is it international
Mm.
mitigation efforts, or is it what's going on in Antarctica? What should we be paying attention to?
Right.
And
So,
if
so
they
what, but
answer
what you're
those questions, everybody around the world should be answering those same questions.
Yeah, and that's the point that I was going to make as well, because what happens, what you appear to be saying is that look, here is the San Fran experience, and it's basically cascading. It's not just cascading at potential responses, but with the various risk factors that are baked into this, but it's also provoking similar conversations elsewhere, but also looking at other factors, existential perhaps, that we need to take into account too. That
Yes,
must be very satisfying.
well, it is, and it's absolutely that. We can only hope that people share those experiences. That there are things that are set up to do that. A perfect place would be the Davos economic meetings, and San Francisco could be a perfect case study.
Given that the conversations that are happening, the change in thinking, which you have seen since you first entered the climate change arena, okay, pushing back against the hostility, etc., does that make you more optimistic about humanity's ability to combat climate change? Because clearly there is a willingness to embrace new ways of thinking and move the conversation to widen it.
Yeah, more is a comparative adjective, so it's more compared to what? Compared to if this weren't happening, absolutely, much more optimistic. Compared to focusing all of my attention and nervous energy to the opposition, um, it, 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 it I do scenario analysis for a living. I like to tell myself scenarios. And if I can't tell myself a scenario where something good is going to happen, like there will be consistent and persistent adoption of plans that can accommodate some of this enormous uncertainty, that makes me optimistic
Mm.
compared to shutting everything down.
Are these
We can't afford to
conversations
shut everything down.
Right, but are these conversations now within or just entering the mainstream, or are you seeing them in the mainstream already, but they just need a little bit more space to burgeon out, to take over that conversational mainstream, that thinking mainstream?
The details are emerging place by place and case by case. The switch to iterative risk management happened when language to that extent that this is how to approach climate change emerged from the fourth IPCC assessment in 2007, and it really changed the way the world looked at things. Um, just about everybody put aside their cost benefit tools as one set of the tools. And didn't throw them away, but they said there's other ways of organizing our thoughts, and these ways are that we can organize our thoughts, simplify what we have to do. We can become comfortable with a tolerable level of risk, as hard as that is. But then the problem is, how do we maintain that tolerable level of risk at least cost? Um, that removes a lot of points of uncertainty. And what do you monitor? You monitor whether or not you're maintaining that tolerable level of risk. If you're not, you better hurry up and do more. If things are going okay, um, okay, move on to the next place.
But either which way, guard against complacency. But Gary, yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Gary is the Huffington Foundation Professor of Economics and Environmental Studies, Emeritus. Thank you so much for joining me on the European Magazine webcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.